So the subject of our safety moment webinar today is lone worker safety, and I'll be doing that presentation. This is something that's been on my mind for a number of years, as you know, based on some incidents that have happened and just some concerns, and it's becoming more and more of a in vogue subject in the safety world because of some high profile incidents that have happened, and really just an overall concern or an awareness of the risks that people working alone face. And so we thought it would be appropriate to give a presentation on this. What can we do to keep those workers safe that are working on their own? So let's start off with a poll. Let me do this. We'll open the poll now, and that should pop up on your screen. And so there are 3 questions there. And so if you'd take just a second to answer those questions, I think it'd be interesting. The results in the first session that we did pretty much mirrored what I thought people would respond. But polls sometimes have a tendency to surprise us. So we'll just give you a minute or so to finish up responding to the poll, and then see what we come up with. Whoops, I have a typo. Darn it. Do you ever work alone? That makes me feel a little bad. Yes, I do know that, Debbie. I went out of presentation mode right now just so the poll would work. Sometimes if I'm in presentation mode, it causes me a little bit of grief there. All right, looks like we are about 2/3 finished there. I'll give you 10 more seconds to finish up, and then we'll close up this poll and see what we come up with. All right, that got us up to almost 75%. Oh, we got over 75%, and I will close the poll. So the first question, besides my typo, do you ever work alone? And responses on that, wow, 75%. That was even more than what we found. Uh-oh, sorry, we just got a little delay on the. Sorry, folks, can you hear me now? Brent, you got me?
I hear you, Jason. Go ahead.
So apparently that poll decided to crash the entire system. Sorry about that. Let me pull the poll up really quick, and we'll see what we've got. So, oh, I can't see the results. It crashed my poll. Well, let me tell you what the polls basically showed. Almost everybody works alone at times. What does that mean? Maybe nothing. Kind of depends on what we're doing. Do you ever perform dangerous tasks alone? And what we found in the first session, and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to see this because of the little crash there to see what your results were, but in the first session it was about 65% of people responded that they do dangerous tasks by themselves. And do you have a system, or does your organization have systems in place to keep track of people when they are when they're out doing dangerous tasks by themselves? And what we found in the first session was about 25% would do that. Brent, can you see my screen?
Yes, I see your screen.
Okay, all right. Sorry, guys. Just a little grief there. Is that right? So you can see. All right. Let me
It says a poll.
Okay, good. So what we what we've learned from the polls, even though we didn't get all of your data in there, is that people work alone, and some people are doing dangerous tasks by themselves. Well, this goes right along with my concern. As I work as a risk manager, I have to be looking out there and saying, okay, besides what are we seeing, what is the potential risk that we see among trust members and their employees? And so working alone is one of those risks that I see as a real potential for us. Everybody does this. It is dangerous. There have been a number of stories, and since we've been talking about Moab all session, we'll go back to an incident that happened near Moab. This was several years ago. A man named Aaron Ralston went on a hike by himself and didn't tell anybody where he was going. He went into a slot canyon, and as he was climbing through, he dislodged a boulder, and it fell down onto his arm. And I think this is a recreation where he showed what he was doing. That might actually be. It's just the picture I was able to find.
Jason,
his arm. Yes.
We're not seeing your screen now.
You're
can't.
Not seeing my screen now.
We lost it.
That is weird. How about now?
You might need to hit play there to open it.
What's that?
You need to hit play to open it. Yeah.
You see that?
There you go. I see it now.
Well, that was weird. Okay. So Mr. Ralston went on this hike, and this boulder dislodged, and it pinned his arm to the point where it did significant damage, and he could not get his arm, his hand free from the boulder. And he tried and tried and tried, and finally, after an extended period of time, it became clear to him that he either had to cut his arm off or he was going to die right where he was. And so he went to work, and he took out a multi-tool that he had and went to cutting, and had to break the bones in his arm to get out of there, and then do some first aid to bind up the wound enough that he could get back to medical attention without bleeding to death. Anyway, pretty crazy, intense story that happened to somebody in our neck of the woods. But it highlights the risks of going alone, and more importantly, not telling anybody where you are and when you're expected to return. And this is not the only story. As I was researching for this presentation, I found literally dozens of different examples of incidents where somebody was working with equipment, and they got entangled in a machine and basically had to do the same thing that Mr. Ralston did, and cut their own arm off to free themselves from the machine. There were just a significant number of these where people had been assaulted by someone, clerks working in an overnight convenience store or other places like that ended up being assaulted, and nobody went looking for them until the morning when the owner came in. Anyway, lots of stories about that. It's dangerous work, and this is something that kind of pops into our minds about, well, what type of tasks are we talking about? I'll ask a question here, and I'm going to have to let me go out of this because I can't see people's comments. Would you type in the chat box, is there some task that you will not do on your own? Is there a job that you say, I got to have backup on this? I'm just trying to catch up here while you're typing. Okay. Debbie says, anything in confined spaces. Here, here. I 100% and totally agree with confined spaces. Okay. Anything else anybody wants to type in there? I think I got my system back working again. I hope. So confined spaces are a big one. It's like nobody wants to comment anything else. I think through some of those jobs, is there something that you want to ensure that people are there? Alex says chainsaw operation, brush chipper, a stump grinder, yeah, that heavy mechanical equipment, those types of tasks. And we've had people respond in the first session, changing out chlorine cylinders at the chlorinator at the water system. So yeah, there are all kinds of hazardous tasks. Some of those are pretty obvious, some of them are not. What about law enforcement, fire and EMS work? You think about that. A lot of times we have our police officers out there doing certain tasks. That's pretty hazardous as well. How do we keep track of them? We'll talk a little more about that. What about landscaping work? One of the stories that I found was a person working at a golf course, and his lawnmower got away from him and pinned him up against a tree, and he sat there pinned against the tree until somebody came along on the golf course and was able to free him from that. Pretty scary work there. Working with customers. Well, what's dangerous about that? Well, the customers are dangerous. Utility shutoffs. This is one of those hazardous tasks that folks that are working in public works may have to do once or twice a month, where they go out, and if somebody didn't pay their water bill, they have to go out and physically turn off the water to that home. That can be a really hazardous task. If we're alone, that puts us at risk because maybe we're one-on-one, or maybe one on a dozen people that are there. Is that the type of task that we want to be doing alone? And I just throw that out as a question. Working at height might be another dangerous task. Climbing ladders, working on rooftops, those types of tasks. Telework. Maybe you work out of a home office part-time. I get to do a day in the home office. Everybody wants, that's what a lot of people want to be able to say. Is that risky? Guess it depends on what your home office looks like. Driving. This is probably Doug, Brent, and myself. This is our biggest exposure. Is we drive all over the state. We go out and we do training. We do risk assessments. We do a lot of different things. But there may be a day where we have to drive significant miles, and we might not reach our destination till late in the evening. Is there what would happen if we got stranded or had a problem between one place and another? Sometimes we'll take the scenic route to get from one place to another because it's a little quicker, or maybe it's just to change up the scenery. But have we told anybody that we're going what route that we're taking? Okay. What about your job? Do you do some work alone? So then we ask the question: are there any regulations that say that we can't work alone, or that we have to have some procedures in place for lone working? And the answer is there's no specific regulation that is based around lone workers. If you look at OSHA, you can't find something that specifically addresses that. Now, within certain regulations, there are some requirements based on those things. Somebody brought up confined space entry. That's one area where you are required by law to have an attendant outside of that confined space who can monitor the air in the space that you're inside of, and also be able to summon rescue if need be. So that's a legal requirement. That hazardous waste operations, when we're working with that, responding to a hazardous waste release, we go in, we use the buddy system. We go in pairs, and that regulation specifically calls out 2 go in and 2 need to be outside of the area ready to respond to provide aid should there be a problem. So it's not just a second person, it's actually 4 people are required to do that type of work. in the respiratory protection standard, it talks about IDLH atmospheres. That's immediately dangerous to life and health. So if we're at a concentration that could kill us or cause us to be incapacitated or not be able to leave the area, then we're required to have somebody outside. So we're wearing respiratory protection, but maybe the pump stops working on our airline respirator, and we have a problem in there. There needs to be somebody outside of the space to provide aid, to render aid to us in IDLH atmospheres. Power transmission, certain jobs when we're working with electrical transmission, diving, so underwater scuba diving, laboratory work. So if I'm working in the lab late at night, you know every time when there's one of those comic books starts, when there's one of those horror movies, it's that scientist working late at night in the laboratory that ends up getting exposed to whatever. And so specifically in the laboratory standard, OSHA said you've got to have some controls in place for working alone in the lab. So there are about a little more than a half a dozen standards that call out some sort of program or a specific requirement to have more than one worker there. We're a little bit behind the game when it comes to lone worker safety, though. Around the world, Australia, Canada, Europe, and other countries have done quite a bit of work. Some have promulgated specific standards on managing lone worker safety, but there is no consensus from a global standpoint. Even in Canada, who by all rights have some of the better standards that we see around the world, have done it by province, and they're different. So there's really no consensus over what should a standard be. But as I look through the standards that exist around the world, there were some common points that we needed to have in place, whether there's a regulation or not. These are things that that if our program has this, we're going to be ahead of the curve. So here are those commonalities that I found throughout those standards and policies that I looked at. Understanding the nature of the hazards. We have to do a hazard assessment and say, this job is more risky than another job. This job has these specific hazards that we're worried about. If I go out on a water main break in the middle of the night in the dark, and I've got to dig a hole with the backhoe, and I've got high pressure water going out, if I do that alone, that's a pretty risky job that probably should have some controls in place and maybe should require that secondary person to keep us safe. The second thing is recognizing what that risk is, and take action to reduce the risk. So can we eliminate the need to enter a confined space? Can I put a radio read meter on that meter that's down in the confined space so I don't have to go in? That's the best way to deal with confined space, is never get in it. Then we don't have the risk. And then look at safe implementing programs. So let's go back to understanding the hazards. Let's ask these questions. If I get trouble, who's going to help? Who will render aid? Who's going to come looking for me if I don't show up back at the shop? How long is that going to take? So who can I contact? How can I contact them? And what are they going to do to help? Are they capable of rendering aid? How far away are they? And is that help going to be adequate? There's all kinds of questions that we have to answer, and in some places, our communication is almost impossible because we have to go up the canyon to our water collection facility or someplace where we don't have cell coverage or radio coverage. Our options are really limited in being able to contact somebody and call out for help. So we have to recognize the risks. Some jobs are more dangerous than others. So for me, driving to St. George to go to speak at a conference, that's a hazardous task for me. but it may not be something as hazardous as requiring the attendant outside of a confined space, or I'm going to call in when I go to do this task, and after 20 minutes or whatever the reasonable time frame that I've given the person, I need to report back and say I'm okay, or they're going to call and see if I'm okay. And if I don't answer, they're calling out the cavalry. So based on the hazards and the risks that we face in the job, our response is going to be a little bit different. And just the point is, being alone changes things. So taking action, we want to develop a program or a policy, or probably a little bit of both, to address lone worker risks. Part of that policy and program is to identify those critical tasks. What are the jobs that we do that require extra oversight to ensure the worker stays safe? We want to create a checkup/check-in procedure. Checkup check-in is a great program to ensure that we're safe out on the job. So what do you say? What does that mean? Well, a checkup. This is a periodic. Hey, are you okay? So this may be a supervisor, or you may have somebody else that has this requirement to check in on people throughout the day. This probably falls under that supervisory responsibility. Keep up with what your people are doing. Are they doing all right? The check-in, that's a periodic. Hey, I'm okay. Don't worry about it. I'm good. And so we ask on this: who should be a part of this? How often should you check in? And that's kind of a tough question. When we start talking timing, we're going to look back at what's the risk. I'm going in to change out a chlorine cylinder on a chlorinator. How much time would elapse before, if something went wrong, before things would go really wrong? Well, that's a matter of a couple of minutes. And so some of these critical tasks, it might be a quick check-in. I've got to let people know, okay, I'm going in now, and I'm going to do this task, and I will call you back in 3 minutes, because I'm just going to check out this cylinder and be back. And if I don't hear, because if a person goes down from chlorine exposure, we don't have minutes, we have seconds to be able to respond. Okay? So how often? That's a decision we have to make based on the hazards of the job. So communication is such an essential part. Here are the rules for it. It's got to work. It has to be able to work, and it needs to be able to work everywhere. And we run into situations in Utah, even though our cell coverage is getting better, there are still a lot of locations in the state where you can't get a cell signal, and so a check-in procedure probably isn't going to work in those areas. So how do I handle that? Well, we've got to be creative in our options. Sometimes I'm going to provide a second person for this task because we identified this is too dangerous, or we don't have the ability to monitor that person remotely. Now there are resources that we can use. Besides just a cell phone, a text in or a call in procedure to let somebody know that you're okay, or to check on somebody. There are radios that many of you use in your operations. There are things that are a medic alert type service where you've got a panic button or a push button. And then for certain tasks that are done in areas where you just really don't have any ability to communicate through cell phone or radio, there are GPS services where you can let somebody know that you're okay. You can also have a little panic button. Is life alert available as well? Yeah, absolutely. And I just threw medic alert on there because most people understand that, but I've got a list of over a dozen services, and I'll send that out as we notify that this recording is available. whole variety of different services that are out there that you can get some information back to people. For people that are in the backcountry, maybe you're a forest ranger and you throw a backpack on your back to go way back in the backcountry and do your job. They have GPS systems, and there's a couple here. There's a Spot is one that I'm familiar with because we've used that on backpacking trips in the past. Haven't used it, but we had it along with us, and that was nice. Well, I take that back. We did actually use it because we had the text capability, and we sent out a message. It was a Boy Scout trip, and so we sent out a message to all the parents that said, "We're here. Everybody's okay. Don't worry about us." But that's the Spot. I've used that one. Then there's this InReach service that's from DeLorme, and there are various others. I'm not advocating one over another, just saying that they exist. And they're really neat systems. You can communicate back and forth. Some of them will just have a panic button on there that says, "I need search and rescue. I need medical attention." You push that button, and the cavalry will be there as soon as they can get there. And they have your GPS location, so they can come to where you are. So obviously this is kind of in for those extreme cases, but there may be situations where we'd use that. Other systems that we may be interested in using are for those situations where I've got one of those really risky tasks, or I'm going to be working alone in a risky area maybe overnight. I'm the night watch person, or I'm running this machine overnight, and it's a risky thing, but we've only got one person there. There are mobile applications, and I threw a few up here, but like I said, I've got a whole list of various different things. There's a lone worker app, the StaySafe. StaySafe was the one that I was quite impressed with. It's produced out of Europe, and these applications work on your smartphone, which obviously means that you have to have cell service. If you're out of cell service, it doesn't do you any good. But what this does is it has a monitoring system in, and you can identify the hazardous tasks. And when you're going to do that, you start that task by pushing a button, and it says, "I'm doing this," and somebody on the other end of the system, a supervisor or somebody that's designated to do that, gets a notification. This person is starting this hazardous task. And it starts a timer. And if you haven't responded in that I'm okay within a certain amount of time, it will send out an alert, and then the person on the other end will make contact with you. If they can't, then they'll push a button that will dispatch emergency services. Also on this system, it has a panic button. If you have a problem, you get injured, you push the panic button, and that will immediately send out an alert to dispatch emergency services. One of the really cool parts of this application, and several like it, is they have a system where it monitors your movement, and if you don't move for a specified amount of time, then it's going to send out an alert. And so the person monitoring that person will get that alert, and they'll attempt to make contact. If they can't, then they can send out emergency services. So if somebody happened to be injured or had a medical condition, this application would let another person know, even if they were incapacitated or weren't able to respond. It's a pretty cool system, and they're only going to get better. So these are things that you can consider. Of course, there's a subscription. There's a cost with each one of these things. Most of the apps are free, but you've got to pay for the service to monitor the people. So anyway, all kinds of really, really cool stuff. I wish I had the perfect solution for this problem, but I don't believe it exists. And so for us, the most important thing to do today is to start the conversation and say, do we have any tasks like this where people are performing hazardous tasks alone? do we have any situations where we would need to keep track of our people? They work in a remote location, or they work alone for extended periods of time. Let's identify those. Let's identify the hazards, what's there, what we need to do to mitigate those hazards. Let's identify communication. What's an adequate time frame on keeping track of people? Do we have a simple check-in or check-up procedure? Do we have maybe we have people going into the backcountry and we need one of these GPS systems? But let's just start the conversation and say, how do we prevent somebody from having an incident and not us not knowing about it until it's too late? That's the overall concern of this. In many cases, this is not going to produce a serious need for us to change a lot of things. It would simply require us to think about it and come up with a simple thing. You know, as Brent and I are out and about, maybe I arrive at my desk. Well, let's see, Doug's going to southeastern Utah today. Maybe when Doug arrives at his destination, he sends a text to Brent and myself and says, "Hey, I'm here. All is well." That could be the real simple end of things, all the way to really using technology in case somebody tips over in a hazardous location. So all kinds of stuff to talk about. Please, if you have any questions or comments, or if you have something, particularly if you have something that you're using in your organizations that works really well to track people, track lone workers, and keep them safe, I'd love to hear about it. So go ahead and type your questions, comments in the chat box or the Q&A box. All right, Debbie comments here. The information is similar to what my workplace had in Montana during winter season. We had check-in when traveling. We personally do this when my family is traveling. Yeah, you know, that simple thing. Hey, I'm going from point A to point B. This is when I expect to arrive. A simple communication like that is a great way to not disappear. All right. Not seeing any other comments there. Brent, you got anything to add?
I think you hit on some really good points. It can happen to any of us when we're out by ourselves, including, you know, recreation and travel, and it's definitely good to check in with someone. So thanks for sharing that.
Thanks, Brent. I don't see any other comments or questions coming on there, so we're going to wrap it up. Thank you for your attendance, folks. We appreciate your support of our training programs. We hope you take this information and do something about it, and you know, really open the conversation. So we're thinking about what could happen. How do we prevent these incidents from happening? Thanks, everybody. Go out and have a safe day.